Imagine an intensely concentrated beam of light striking a crystalline prism. As it passes through the dense glass, it fractures. It multiplies into countless distinct rays, expanding outward to illuminate a vastly wider surface area than the original beam ever could alone. In the Gospel of John, chapter 14, verse 12, Jesus presents a statement that operates on a similar physical principle. He says, "Very truly I tell you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and in fact will do greater works than these." Read at face value, this sets up an immediate theological paradox. Jesus of Nazareth, the incarnate God, claims that his finite human followers will accomplish works that surpass the output of his own earthly ministry. Historical theology has attempted to contextualize this. Augustine, in his City of God, emphasized the tight unity between Christ and the Church, arguing that they act as one continuous body. However, the exact phrasing of John 14:12 goes further than simple continuity. It promises an actual comparative increase in output. This forces a structural question. How can human beings accomplish greater works than God in human form without violating the premise that God possesses ultimate, unapproachable power? Resolving this tension requires us to step away from traditional assumptions. We have to map out exactly how divine power interacts with human reality, structurally redefining the mechanics of grace. Biblical scholars typically use two standard frameworks to try and solve the John 14:12 paradox, the quantitative view and the qualitative view. This diagram maps both approaches. Left is the quantitative view, attributing greater works to rapid numerical spread, tracking an exponential curve after Pentecost. Right is the qualitative view, pointing to sudden spikes and miracles, emphasizing a new era of the Holy Spirit. Both interpretations correctly identify the Holy Spirit as the power source, but they share a critical structural flaw. They assume divine agency is operating completely independently, treating human beings merely as passive endpoints for a divine transaction. The true enabling condition for these greater works requires a much deeper, more active level of human participation. The catalyst is the believer's distinct ontological and experiential reality. The believer occupies a highly specific border space, operating as a direct, synergistic conduit for divine action. To understand exactly how these greater works operate, we have to examine this new model, one that places the human ontological position at the absolute center of kingdom expansion. Building this synergistic model begins with the foundational Greek text. The word translated as greater is meizōn. It is the comparative form of megos, meaning large or great. Etymologically, meizōn dictates a difference in degree or extent compared to a baseline. Critically, this linguistic root does not imply works that are superior in miraculous power. Ultimate power belongs exclusively to the Father. It cannot be superseded. We can map this linguistic distinction clearly using a 2D coordinate system. We place divine power on the vertical y-axis and scope and impact on the horizontal x-axis. First, we plot the theoretical maximum of divine power. This horizontal line represents the Father's ultimate capability. It is a static ceiling. It does not and cannot move upward. If we plot the precise meaning of meizōn on this graph, we see that the promised increase happens strictly along the axes of spatial and temporal reach. It moves outward, not upward. The greater works present a structural engineering problem regarding the expansion of impact. This completely resolves the initial paradox of a human outperforming God's power. This raises a question regarding the narrative source. Why does the Son articulate this specific promise of comparative increase rather than the Father? The answer lies in what theologians call the incarnate perspective. As described in Philippians 2, the incarnation required Jesus to accept specific, self-imposed limitations of human form. Looking at this diagram of his earthly ministry, we see a highly concentrated point of divine action, but it is structurally bounded by strict geographic and temporal reality. Jesus could only be in one physical location at a time. Because of this, Jesus uniquely understood the friction between his finite, localized human form and the Father's ultimate global vision. He understood his own bounded ministry, but he also possessed knowledge of the unbounded Holy Spirit promised in Acts 1:8. Under the incarnate constraint, divine power hits the geographic boundary and stops. The Son recognized that bypassing this incarnational bottleneck required a systemic change. It required a decentralized global network of human agents. The promise of John 14:12 is Jesus acknowledging a mathematical reality. A distributed, spirit-empowered network is structurally superior for global expansion than a single incarnate body. To understand how that network functions, we have to look closely at its individual nodes, the believers themselves. Systematic theologian Karl Rahner extensively studied the human position in relation to grace. He argued that humanity possesses an inherent orientation toward the divine. Through explicit faith and the indwelling of the Spirit, this inherent orientation is activated. This activation transitions the believer from possessing a mere theoretical capacity for God into an actual ontological partnership where the human and divine intersect. This Venn diagram visualizes that shift. It maps the creation of a new, overlapping spatial territory between the Creator and the created. We define this intersection point as the theological border space. It is a continuous state of immanent grace. Occupying this border space is an experiential condition. It is the specific mechanical requirement that turns a human from a passive observer into an active conduit. Without this specific, spirit-indwelt ontological overlap between God and humanity, the expanded reach of the greater works is structurally impossible. We can test this theological border concept by cross-pollinating it with modern cultural anthropology. The anthropologist Veena Das has spent decades studying human behavior in marginal, boundary conditions. Her primary finding challenges the assumption that border zones are passive. She demonstrates that liminal spaces are precisely where transformative action and highly creative agency emerge. If we map this anthropological concept of liminal agency directly onto our theological border space, we see the individual believers operating inside the overlap. Believers operating with liminal agency actively process divine power. In this state, grace is refracted through the specific details of a human life, rather than simply terminating at a passive endpoint. Divine power enters the human node, but before it exits into the world, it is actively shaped and multiplied by the believer's unique human agency, their specific context, and their individual decisions. This dynamic is explicitly synergistic. The human relies on the divine power, but the divine power utilizes the human's specific capacity for outward reach. Human liminal agency is the crucial multiplier in the physics of grace. It is the exact mechanism that turns standard divine action into greater works. This understanding forces us to challenge a lingering assumption, the expectation that greater works must look like spectacular, isolated, miraculous feats. Veena Das's work provides a secondary focus here. She identifies the ordinary and the mundane routines of everyday life as the primary site of profound, world-altering action. Theologically, this anthropological focus on the ordinary aligns perfectly with the Christological doctrine of the priesthood of all believers, detailed in 1 Peter. Under this synergistic framework, the true greater works are the cumulative systemic impacts of millions of spirit-led lives. They enact justice, practice love, and bear witness not on a grand stage, but in mundane, everyday spheres. These millions of local actions aggregate, eventually overriding the existing environment with the structural logic of the kingdom. The synergistic model turns the quietest, most ordinary human existence into the frontline mechanism for kingdom expansion. If we bring all these variables together, the Greek etymology of meizōn, the incarnate constraint, the ontological border space, and liminal agency, we can map the final macro-level system. Returning to our coordinate system, we map the historical activation of this network, starting from the incarnate node at the origin. Empowered by the Spirit, the network propagates endlessly outward along the horizontal axis of scope, firmly remaining beneath the maximum ceiling of divine power. This activated network resolves the paradox. The collective output of the global church visually and structurally dwarfs the geographical footprint of Jesus' earthly ministry. The promise is fulfilled, and it achieves this vast expansion without ever requiring human beings to usurp the ultimate power of the Father. Ultimately, John 14:12 is a validation of the human condition. It proves that the ordinary, spirit-indwelt believer is not a secondary option. They are God's exact engineered mechanism for ultimate impact in the world.